We have an international paedophile ring that's been operating within every democratic government on our planet. There has also been connections to the Middle East all over the world. We're looking at the killing of children. We're going back to just a guy called Sidney Cook, which those that are initiated into this subject will understand. We're looking at the torture of children. We're looking at snuff movies. We're talking about cruelty, and I'm not just talking about in this country, I'm talking about all over the world, every sovereign country, everywhere. We're talking about disabled children being ferried between all the Channel Islands, especially the Isle of Sark, the Isle of Wight, Jersey and Guernsey. We're talking about, I don't know if you can put it down as a religion, as a satanic religion. Is it a religion? This is not a sexual thing. The killing and the making of snuff movies, the trafficking of children, the raping, the torture of disabled children. It is, like I say, I don't know what word to use, I just see it as a satanic religion. The alternative media is working with the national media, and it is not just Pie and Mash Films. At the moment, I have a very small, tight team working on this, but the national media is working with the alternative media. Right. And we are talking about kidnapping, murder, torture. It is as we've always thought that world politics, the national media and the alternative media to a degree is being controlled by paedophilia versus blackmail.
So, consider this fictitious example that's inspired by real life. Say you're watching the news and you see a story about a new study on the cholesterol-lowering drug called Cholextra. The study says Cholextra is so effective that doctors should consider prescribing it to adults and even children who don't yet have high cholesterol. Is it too good to be true? You're smart, you decide to do some of your own research. You do a Google search, you consult social media, Facebook and Twitter, you look at Wikipedia, WebMD, a nonprofit website, and you read the original study in a peer-reviewed published medical journal. It all confirms how effective Cholextra is. You do run across a few negative comments and a potential link to cancer, but you dismiss that because medical experts call the cancer link a myth and say that those who think there is a link there are quacks and cranks and nuts. Finally, you learn that your own doctor recently attended a medical seminar. The lecture that he attended confirmed how effective Cholextra is, so he sends you off with some free samples and a prescription. You've really done your homework. But what if all isn't as it seems? What if the reality you found was false? A carefully constructed narrative by unseen special interests designed to manipulate your opinion. A Truman Show-esque alternate reality all around you. Complacency in the news media combined with incredibly powerful propaganda and publicity forces mean we sometimes get little of the truth. Special interests have unlimited time and money to figure out new ways to spin us while cloaking their role. Surreptitious astroturf methods are now more important to these interests than traditional lobbying of Congress. There's an entire industry built around it in Washington. What is astroturf? It's a perversion of grassroots, as in fake grassroots. AstroTurf is when political, corporate, or other special interests disguise themselves and publish blogs, start Facebook and Twitter accounts, publish ads, letters to the editor, or simply post comments online to try to fool you into thinking an independent or grassroots movement is speaking. The whole point of AstroTurf is to try to give the impression there's widespread support for or against an agenda when there's not. AstroTurf seeks to manipulate you into changing your opinion by making you feel as if you're an outlier when you're not. One example is the Washington Redskins name. Without taking a position on the controversy, if you simply were looking at news media coverage over the course of the past year or looking at social media, you'd probably have to conclude that most Americans find that name offensive and think it ought to be changed. But what if I told you 71% of Americans say the name should not be changed? That's more than 2/3. AstroTurfers seek to controversialize those who disagree with them. They attack news organizations that publish stories they don't like, whistleblowers who tell the truth, politicians who dare to ask the tough questions, and journalists who have the audacity to report on all of it. Sometimes astroturfers simply shove intentionally so much confusing and conflicting information into the mix that you're left to throw up your hands and disregard all of it, including the truth. Drown out a link between a medicine and a harmful side effect, say vaccines and autism, by throwing a bunch of conflicting paid-for studies, surveys, and experts into the mix, confusing the truth beyond recognition. And then there's Wikipedia. AstroTurf's dream come true. Billed as the free encyclopedia that anyone can edit, the reality can't be more different. Anonymous Wikipedia editors control and co-opt pages on behalf of special interests. They forbid and reverse edits that go against their agenda. They skew and delete information in blatant violation of Wikipedia's own established policies with impunity, always superior to the poor schlubs who actually believe anyone can edit Wikipedia, only to discover they're barred from correcting even the simplest factual inaccuracies. Try adding a footnoted fact or correcting a fact error on one of these monitored Wikipedia pages and poof, sometimes within a matter of seconds you'll find your edit is reversed. In 2012, famed author Philip Roth tried to correct a major fact error about the inspiration behind one of his book characters cited on a Wikipedia page. But no matter how hard he tried, Wikipedia's editors wouldn't allow it. They kept reverting the edits back to the false information. When Roth finally reached a person at Wikipedia, which was no easy task, and tried to find out what was going wrong, they told him he simply was not considered a credible source on himself. A few weeks later, there was a huge scandal when Wikipedia officials got caught offering a PR service that skewed and edited information on behalf of paid, publicity-seeking clients in utter opposition to Wikipedia's supposed policies. All of this may be why, when a medical study looked at medical conditions described on Wikipedia pages and compared it to actual peer-reviewed published research, Wikipedia contradicted medical research 90% of the time. You may never fully trust what you read on Wikipedia again, nor should you. Let's now go back to that fictitious Colextra example and all the research you did. It turns out the Facebook and Twitter accounts you found that were so positive were actually written by paid professionals hired by the drug company to promote the drug. The Wikipedia page had been monitored by an agenda editor also paid by the drug company. The drug company also arranged to optimize Google search engine results, so it was no accident that you stumbled across that positive nonprofit that had all those positive comments. The nonprofit was, of course, secretly founded and funded by the drug company. The drug company also financed that positive study and used its power of editorial control to omit any mention of cancer as a possible side effect. Once more, each and every doctor who publicly touted Colextra or called the cancer link a myth, or ridiculed critics as paranoid cranks and quacks, or served on a government advisory board that approved the drug, each of those doctors is actually a paid consultant for the drug company. As for your own doctor, the medical lecture he attended that had all those positive evaluations was, in fact, like many continuing medical education classes, sponsored by the drug company. And when the news reported on that positive study, it didn't mention any of that. I have tons of personal examples from real life. A couple of years ago, CBS News asked me to look into a story about a study coming out from the nonprofit National Sleep Foundation. Supposedly, this press release coming out said, the study concluded we are a nation with an epidemic of sleeplessness and we don't even know it, and we should all go ask our doctors about it. A couple of things struck me about that. First, I recognized the phrase, ask your doctor, as a catchphrase promoted by the pharmaceutical industry. They know that if they can get your foot through the door of the doctor's office to mention a malady, you're very likely to be prescribed the latest drug that's marketed. Second, I wondered how serious an epidemic of sleeplessness could really be if we don't even know that we have it. Right? It didn't take long for me to do a little research and discover that the National Sleep Foundation nonprofit and the study, which was actually a survey, not a study, were sponsored in part by a new drug that was about to be launched onto the market called Lunesta, a sleeping pill. I reported the study as CBS News asked, but of course I disclosed the sponsorship behind the nonprofit and the survey so that viewers could weigh the information accordingly. All the other news media reported the same survey directly off the press release as written without digging past the superficial. It later became an example written up in the Columbia Journalism Review, which quite accurately reported that only we at CBS News had bothered to do a little bit of research and disclose the conflict of interest behind this widely reported survey. So now you may be thinking, what can I do? I thought I'd done my research. What chance do I have separating fact from fiction, especially if seasoned journalists with years of experience can be so easily fooled? Well, I have a few strategies that I can tell you about to help you recognize signs of propaganda and astroturf. Once you start to know what to look for, you'll begin to recognize it everywhere. First, hallmarks of astroturf include use of inflammatory language such as crank, quack, nutty, lies, paranoid, pseudo, and conspiracy. Astroturfers often claim to debunk myths that aren't myths at all. Use of the charged language tests well. People hear something's a myth, maybe they find it on Snopes, and they instantly declare themselves too smart to fall for it. But what if the whole notion of the myth is itself a myth, and you and Snopes fell for that? Beware when interests attack an issue by controversializing or attacking the people, personalities, and organizations surrounding it rather than addressing the facts. That could be astroturf. And most of all, astroturfers tend to reserve all of their public skepticism for those exposing wrongdoing rather than the wrongdoers. In other words, instead of questioning authority, they question those who question authority. You might start to see things a little more clearly. It's kind of like taking off your glasses and wiping them and putting them back on and realizing for the first time how foggy they'd been all along. I can't resolve these issues, but I hope that I've given you some information that will at least motivate you to take off your glasses and wipe them and become a wiser consumer of information in an increasingly artificial, paid-for reality. Thank you.
There is systemic bias, quite a lot of it. Western, white bias, male bias. About 90% of the editors on Wikipedia are male. So that's a problem right there.
The year is 1917, and Representative Oscar Callaway enters a disturbing statement into the U.S. Congressional Record. The statement reveals why J.P. Morgan interests hired 12 high-ranking news managers. The 12 were asked to determine the most influential newspapers in America. They were to figure out how many news organizations it would take to control generally the policy of the daily press of the United States. The 12 found it was only necessary to purchase the control of 25 of the greatest papers. An agreement was reached. The policy of the papers was bought, and an editor was placed at each paper to ensure that all published information was in keeping with the new policy. Soon, that policy would be defined by a front group formed by J.P. Morgan and his colleagues. In fact, Morgan's personal attorney was founding president of the organization, the Council on Foreign Relations. Today, the CFR maintains that its goal is to increase America's understanding of the world. However, the actual objective of this highly exclusive club is revealed by the rare admissions of the insiders themselves. In the early 60s, a Georgetown University professor collects information for a book favorable to the network of powerful men who founded the CFR. For 2 years, Professor Carroll Quigley is allowed to examine the confidential papers and secret records of this network. Quigley reveals that these men aim to create a world system of financial control in private hands, able to dominate the political system of each country and the economy of the world as a whole. In short, they seek total and quiet control of the entire world. And the CFR is their most visible conduit for carrying out that agenda. CFR members include America's wealthiest tycoons as well as the highly placed elite in government, academic institutions, tax-exempt foundations, and the establishment media. Ruling Class Journalists, written by Richard Harwood, describes the CFR membership as the ruling establishment in the United States. The Washington Post article boasted that news reporters who are CFR members do not merely analyze and interpret foreign policy for the United States, they help make it. Who are these policymakers? Many of their faces are familiar. NBC's Tom Brokaw, CBS's Dan Rather, ABC's Barbara Walters, Jim Lehrer of PBS, William F. Buckley of National Review, media mogul Rupert Murdoch, owner of the giant multifaceted News Corporation. These media heavyweights, and many others like them, are members of the CFR. Powerful corporations are also invited to become members. At the close of the 20th century, CFR influence presided over far-reaching consolidations of media control. In 1995, CFR members Michael Eisner of Disney and ABC's Thomas Murphy merged their media empires. Soon after the merger, the Disney-ABC empire becomes a CFR corporate member. In the year 2000, the world's largest internet service provider, America Online, joins forces with Time Warner, one of the world's largest news organizations. The CEOs favoring the move are CNN's Thomas Johnson and Time Warner's Gerald Levin, both CFR members. Once again, another media giant is created under the shadow of CFR influence. Today, an elite handful of individuals define the agendas that are supported by the empire of establishment news.
I thought that it was a matter of real concern that planted stories intended to serve a national purpose abroad came home and were circulated here and believed here, because this would mean that the CIA could manipulate the news in the United States by channeling it through some foreign country. Now, we're looking at that very carefully.
Do you have any people being paid by the CIA who are contributing to a major circulation American journal?
We do have people who submit pieces to American journals.
Do you have any people paid by the CIA who are working for television networks?
This, I think, gets into the kind of getting into the details, Mr. Chairman, that I'd like to get into in executive session.
At CBS, we had been contacted by the CIA. As a matter of fact, by the time I became the head of the whole news and public affairs operation in 1954, ships had been established, and I was told about them and asked if I'd carry on with them.
We have quite a lot of detailed information, and we will evaluate it, and we will include any evidence of wrongdoing or any evidence of impropriety in our final report and make recommendations.
Do you have any people being paid by the CIA who are contributing to the national news services, AP and UPI?
Well, again, I think we're getting into the kind of detail, Mr. Chairman, that I'd prefer to handle in executive session.
Senator, do you think that you named the news organizations in your final report?
That remains to be decided.
I think it was entirely in order for our correspondents at that time to make use of CIA agent chiefs of station and other members of the executive staff of CIA as sources of information which were useful in their assessments of world conditions.
Would you say that continues today?
Well, I would think probably for a reporter it would continue today, but because of all of the revelations of the period of the 1970s It seems to me that a reporter's got to be much more circumspect in doing it now, or he runs the risk of at least being looked at with considerable disfavor by the public. I think you've got to be much more careful about it.
Tonight, how much can we believe about the enemies of the United States? In Angola 10 years ago, and in Nicaragua today, we hear accounts of communist expansion. But are such stories true? Tonight, two former CIA officers tell reporter Christopher Hurd how lies invented about Angola and Nicaragua found their way into the world's press. Two experienced journalists tell him the difficulties they've had telling fact from fiction. Some people call this process disinformation, others call it lying. The CIA just call it a standard technique.
The Sandinista dictatorship of Nicaragua, with full Cuban Soviet bloc support, not only persecutes its people, the church, and denies a free press, but arms and provides bases for communist terrorists attacking neighboring states.
As they, you know, the saying that they have is that, this has been said publicly, by the way, by U.S. government spokesman, that our intelligence from Nicaragua is so good, you know, that we can hear the toilets flush in Managua. And I've often thought that that might be the source of some of this information.
Angola, a country at war. Rich in natural resources, as large as France and Spain together, a left-wing government, supported by the Cubans, fights a continual battle against a guerrilla army backed by the South Africans. 10 years ago, the Russians and their allies sent troops and guns into a continent where they had no right to be. According to the newspapers at the time, that's how the Angolan War started. Or did it? John Stockwell worked for the CIA for 12 years, rising to the rank of colonel. His last assignment was to run America's secret campaign in Angola.
We had set ourselves well above and beyond the law, beyond the Congress, beyond the Constitution. We were lying to the President, lying to the Secretary of State, lying to the Congress about what we were doing.
1974, the Portuguese Revolution. The end of centuries of dictatorship and oppression at home, and of Portuguese imperialism in Africa. But as the colonies gain independence, in the largest, Angola, three groups vied for control of one of the richest countries in Africa. Jonas Savimbi, a friend of Che Guevara, but now an anti-Marxist, led UNITA. Agostinho Neto, a Western-educated left-winger, led the MPLA. Holden Roberto led the FNLA. He had been on the payroll of the CIA for 14 years, so he was the obvious choice for the seasoned campaigners back in Washington.
The CIA had just closed down 3 long-term paramilitary operations in Southeast Asia. Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. They'd had over 1,000 paramilitary case officers come flocking back to Washington. They didn't have desks for everybody, much less jobs, and morale was rock bottom low. They wanted a covert action. They wanted a paramilitary encounter. Angola was convenient. There never was a study done of who's who in Angola, who would be best for Angola, who would be best for the CIA or for the United States or what. There was no study done.
Well, the rationale was that the Soviet Union was trying to take advantage of the United States' weakness right after the Vietnam War, that Angola was getting its independence and they were trying to snap it up, and that Henry Kissinger decided that we could not be weak and we wouldn't let them do it. Our own files disproved that. We moved into Angola first and the Russians were responding to us.
But before the CIA could start a war on the other side of the world, in Angola, it needed the approval of the National Security Council, a key part of the American decision-making machine, where policy is made by the top men in the government and the military.
The first briefings on Angola literally went, gentlemen, this is a map of Africa. Here is Angola. And then they went on with a chart to explain there are 3 liberation movements in Angola. One of them is headed by Holden Roberto. He's the good guy. We've worked with him for years, and they use literally good guy. Then the MPLA is headed by this drunken, psychotic Marxist poet, Agostinho Neto. He's the bad guy. And they used exactly so to make sure that people understood. And then, you know, like I say, you pack off and go off to and they come in for the next briefing about Micronesia or somewhere. The superficiality of what I saw fat old men dozing off in subcommittee meetings of the National Security Council in which we were making decisions that were getting people killed. And I mean exactly the way students do in their 9 o'clock class, you know, propping themselves up and getting their glasses balanced so it won't look, you know, people can't tell if they're, and their heads nodding off. And then you'd have to wake them up sort of to get their concurrence on, so I explained something to them again.
But the newspapers contain nothing about the fascinating way in which policy was made. Instead, they fell victim to Stockwell's worldwide campaign of disinformation.
The basic theme was to make it look like a Russian and Cuban aggression in Angola. And so any kind of story that you could write and get into the media anywhere that pushed that line, you did. 1/3 of my staff in this task force was covert action, was propagandists whose professional career jobs was making up stories and finding ways to get them into the press.
From the CIA's headquarters, Stockwell put his propagandists into London, Lisbon, Lusaka and Kinshasa. From the safety of such cities, none of which are actually in Angola, they wrote press releases for the FNLA and UNITA, which were fed into the ticker tapes of the Western media. The propagandists assiduously courted Western journalists, briefing them and wining and dining them. His man in Lusaka was particularly enthusiastic.
He ran a story that the city of Malanje had been captured by the UNITA forces,
and in doing so it captured 20 Russian advisors. And they thought this would show that Russians were running the thing in Angola. There weren't Russian advisors, it wasn't a factor, and we knew that.
So I went to the British Museum's newspaper library to see how successful Stockwell had been. And here's the story in The Guardian, under the headline, UNITA captures 20 Russians. The UNITA statement, with all its convincing detail, is quoted at length. And according to this, there were 500 Russians and other mercenaries involved in the battle, and there were 2 tanks and 3 armoured cars, and even a house full of arms of Russian make. The Guardian put quotes around the headline to show they weren't quite sure of the story, and presumably that's why they put a question mark after this hopeful little piece. The Malanje story also made it to the front page of the Times, which quotes UNITA's claim that they captured 20 Russians in the battle for Malanje. The Times clearly believed UNITA because they helpfully tell us that Malanje used to be under the control of the MPLA. The source for this story was the Reuters correspondent in Lusaka.
I remember reporting that very clearly, and I should stress I was not the only journalist to report it. Many of us reported it, and we pinned it on an official UNITA communique. Years later I discovered that a little CIA misinformation expert had sat in the US Embassy in Lusaka and had composed that communique, and it bore absolutely no relationship at all to truth.
When you reported it, did you think it was true?
I had absolutely no idea. I mean, you've got to remember at that stage, during a war, you're working under incredible pressure. I worked for 4 months without a day off for 16 hours a day. And all that was wanted was a flow of information. I mean, I'd done the same in the Middle East war. I was based in Damascus. And in the first week of the war in Damascus, I wiped out the Israeli Air Force 3 times over, with official statements.
Reuters is one of the world's largest news agencies. Its offices around the globe provide many papers with their only source of news from some parts of the world. Many papers actually rely on the same person for their information, the Reuters correspondent.
Well, I mean, with hindsight, some of the official statements from the side I was reporting, and I stress from the side I was reporting, but also from the side that people in Luanda with the MPLA were reporting, clearly most of those statements were completely false.
most of them were completely false.
I would think so, yes.
Doesn't that mean that for the average reader, we received an absolutely impossibly distorted view of what was going on?
I think that's a very fair assessment.
But newspapers were hungry for stories, and one of Stockwell's propagandists fed them well.
So he came up with another story, which he in fact kept going for weeks, and it was a good story in terms of the CIA's propaganda interests. He had some Cuban soldiers raping some young Angolan girls. Then there was a battle, and he had that Cuban unit cut off and captured. And then he had the Cuban women, the victims, identifying their rapists. And then there was a trial, and they were convicted. And then he had them executed by a firing squad of the women who had supposedly been violated, with photographs of young African women with weapons shooting down these Cubans. There had never been a rape. There had never been the military action. The Cubans had never been captured. It was all fiction.
Stockwell did extremely well with this story. Here's the Daily Express of March the 12th, 1976. "Gun girls execute Cuban rapists" is the headline. And quoting from UNITA, it says that 17 Cubans were executed, 5 of whom had been identified as the people who had raped 4 African women a few weeks before. And here's the Evening Standard, with a bit more convincing detail, saying the Cubans were shot with their own guns. And here's the Daily Telegraph, the newspaper of record, adding a bit more detail, identifying the region from which the women came and saying that they took part in the executions. The reporter was John Bullock.
I haven't the faintest idea whether it was true, and I never said it was true. I reported somebody as saying that, as telling me that story. I certainly didn't report the facts. I reported Mr. A or sources from such and such a group as saying that. I don't know whether it was true. If you don't publish it, maybe it is true. You get, I should have thought, worse criticism for not publishing it than for publishing it. Because when you publish it, you do attribute it quite clearly and firmly to a man, a person who's saying so. If you don't publish it, you're already making a judgment. You're deciding it's not true. It's not our job to decide.
Editors are not going, in most Western newspapers, are not going to be too skeptical of Cuban rapist story. It sort of fits the general Western line and what the West wants to read about Cuba and whatnot. The truth is, all of the information we were getting was that the Cubans were handling themselves brilliantly and very generously towards the Africans.
Basically, and to put it very crudely, you can publish any old crap you like, and it will get newspaper room.
Despite the CIA's best efforts, the armies they supported never stood much of a chance once Cuban soldiers arrived in the autumn of 1975 to help the MPLA. Holden Roberto's FNLA and his CIA mercenaries were wiped out. UNITA and the South Africans beat a hasty retreat. Back in Washington, Congress didn't want another Vietnam and stopped Kissinger from spending any more money in Angola. Interestingly, some American multinationals operating in the country had always supported the MPLA. But when the corporations expressed their views to the American government, they were treated as the enemy.
When we went in, Gulf Oil was pumping the Angolan oil. We forced Gulf to stop. And the way we did this was by Henry Kissinger placing some phone calls and saying that he would open an investigation of international bribery by Gulf Oil Company. The fighting was effectively over in about February of '76. The Congress stopped us then and forced us to withdraw. By early March, within about 3 weeks, Gulf Oil was back with U.S. technicians in Cabinda pumping the Angolan oil, with Cuban soldiers protecting them from CIA mercenaries who were still mucking around in northern Angola. Now, years later, Western corporations are doing business great with Angola. David Rockefeller, Gulf, Boeing, Texaco is building a refinery there, De Beers, working with the diamonds. They all lobby in Washington saying they have no problem doing business with the government of Angola.
But the war still goes on, with the South Africans financing UNITA. The Americans have turned their attention elsewhere, to Nicaragua. Unlike Angola, this is a country which any journalist can visit, so America's lies can be discovered more easily. But these have still dominated the papers. First, there was the arms flow story. According to Reagan, Nicaragua supplied guns to the left-wing guerrillas in neighboring El Salvador. David McMichael was the CIA's senior analyst on Nicaragua. They asked him to write a report on the arms flow. But when he looked at the evidence, it didn't support Reagan's claims.
The argument that we're dealing with here is, do these arms come through or from Nicaragua with the complicity of the Nicaraguan government? And the evidence does not sustain that.
Undeterred, the American government continues to insist that Nicaragua is a center of international communist terrorism. According to Reagan, it harbors members of the IRA, the Red Brigades, the Baader-Meinhof gang, and Basque separatists. So the American government has poured money into supporting the opponents of the Nicaraguan regime.
We have an obligation to be of help where we can to freedom fighters and lovers of freedom and democracy from Afghanistan to Nicaragua.
The freedom fighters he is talking about are called the Contras.
Well, they wouldn't exist without the CIA. They wouldn't. They simply would not exist as a viable force. The Contras never even received money themselves to buy arms. That was all handled for them by the CIA. And there's no way out of saying that the Contra force is essentially and almost entirely a creation of the United States government. The Contras are agents of the United States government.
Since we have been there since the very end of 1981 until now, has been a constant escalation of the war into our area. And there's been a great deal of real terrorism going on in the area. We have mass kidnappings. We've had whole villages that have been swept down on, and they take everyone, women, children, men, animals, everything that moves. We have had rapes and kidnappings, torture, murder, about everything that one could imagine that could happen in a war. And this has been carried out by the Contra.
That is, a standard technique in attempting to destabilize and overthrow a government, is to demonstrate to the citizens of that government, that its government cannot provide security for them. And this is the way to break resistance. And this is what they do. This is the famous CIA manual, the Takayan. Laid this out very clearly for them. It's a very, I hate to say it in this cold-blooded way, but it's a standard technique.
To help, the CIA has produced a Freedom Fighters Manual. This shows how to make Molotov cocktails, how to throw them, and who to throw them at. It gives helpful advice on disrupting transport and communications and destroying property. Other standard techniques are aimed at people.
I'm very embarrassed by the United States support for the Contra, and I think it is illegal and immoral. They don't call Ronald Reagan Ronald, they call him Donald Reagan, which is a play on the word to donation, because everything they have is from him.
They are our brothers, these freedom fighters, and we owe them our help. They are the moral equal of our founding fathers and the brave men and women of the French resistance. We cannot turn away from them.
Well, brothers, I suppose brothers and sisters, we all are of the same God in that sense. Certainly I wouldn't classify them as freedom fighters or as the moral equivalent of our founding fathers in the United States.
In 1981, the CIA asked McMichael for a report on the Nicaraguan press, opposition parties and church.
And my conclusion was that, you know, there was a significant space for these groups to operate, but that they were in no danger of suppression or disappearance. Compared to any other Central American country, Nicaragua has by far the liveliest opposition press and media. Over 2/3, for example, of the 40-odd radio stations in the country are still privately owned and generally speak their mind.
When McMichael spoke his mind, the CIA didn't like it. He was sacked.
The Sandinista dictatorship of Nicaragua, with full Cuban Soviet bloc support, not only persecutes its people, the church, and denies a free press, but arms and provides bases for communist terrorists attacking neighboring states.
I certainly don't recognize any of the diatribes that have been made against the Sandinistas as to the persecution of the church, persecution of peoples, the denial of human rights. That is not in my experience.
After 4 years of fighting the Americans, the Nicaraguan government has now suspended most civil rights. In the world's newsrooms, they are more inclined to listen to the President of America than to the President of Nicaragua. So in the propaganda battle, the CIA's inventions still hit the front page. In 1982, they produced convincing evidence of Soviet bases in Nicaragua.
I used to laugh and say, look at that Soviet-style baseball diamond over there, you know. You know, this is almost foolish, really, you know, to talk about this. First of all, they're not Soviet military bases. That's the whole point. The second is that a barracks is a barracks, you know, an obstacle course is an obstacle course.
How about this for a story? Just under a year ago, the Americans discovered a Soviet freighter carrying MiG fighter planes, which they said were on their way to Nicaragua. Here's the story on the front of the Times. Moscow warned on Nicaraguan MiGs, and there's a picture of a MiG-21. According to President Reagan, this showed that Nicaragua was a threat to the United States.
And as it turned out, this was the evidence for this was based on satellite photography, which showed crates at an East European port facility, which were determined to be, in the science of cratology, the crates of the sort in which MiG aircraft frequently were shipped. And subsequent photographs a day or two later showed that these crates were no longer on the dock. And an amazing leap of logic, it was advanced that necessarily they must have been delivered to Nicaragua, or were on their way to be delivered to Nicaragua. Well, you know, it's the usual thing. The charge makes the headlines. The retraction makes the inside pages. 8 or 10 days later, it's revealed, well, MiGs weren't on the way, but that's no longer a headline. So what one is left with is the overall impression from the screaming headlines of the week earlier that Nicaragua continues to represent this enormous danger to the security of the United States. This nation of 3 million impoverished souls, half of whom are under the age of 15, you know.
Well, I would say people are very silly if they believe everything that newspapers tell them, and I think probably anybody who buys a newspaper needs a course on how to read newspapers.
Part of my reason for coming out of the CIA is that it was a tragedy, a travesty of U.S. principles of freedom and democracy, that you would have the United States setting up a tradition of supporting dictatorships, brutal ones, forming and training their brutal police and death squads, while the Soviet Union, which has had periods of pretty harsh policies towards its own people, is winding up the champion of real freedom throughout the world. If you have a dictator and you want some help getting rid of him, you cannot go to the United States, you can go to the Soviet Union.
People in the foreign policy establishment, let us put it this way, and I believe this is not only true of my own country but many others, you know, believe that in the interest of national policy that it is legitimate to lie. They do not feel it is dishonorable to lie, and when they do lie well, they expect to be rewarded for it.
Well, I've been a journalist for about 25 years, and I was educated to lie, to betray, and not to tell the truth to the public. But seeing right now, within the last months, how far, how the German and American media tries to bring war to the people in Europe, to bring war to Russia. This is a point of no return, and I'm going to stand up and say it is not right what I have done in the past, to manipulate people, to make propaganda against Russia, and it is not right what my colleagues do and have done in the past, because they are bribed to betray the people, not only in Germany, all over Europe. The reason writing this book was that I am very fearful of a new war in Europe, and I don't like to have this situation again, because war is never coming from itself. There is always people behind it to push for war. And this is not only politicians, this is journalists too. And I just have written in the book how we have betrayed in the past our readers just to push for war, and because I don't want this anymore. I'm fed up with this propaganda. We live in a banana republic and not in a democratic country where we have press freedom, where we have human rights. If you see the German media, especially my colleagues who day by day write against the Russians, who are in transatlantic organizations and who are supported by the United States to do so, well, people like me, I became an honorary citizen of the state of Oklahoma in the United States. Just why? Just because I write pro-American. I wrote pro-American. I was supported by the Central Intelligence Agency, by the CIA. Why? Because I should be pro-American. I'm fed up with it. I don't want to do it anymore. And so I've just written a book not to earn money. No, it will cause a lot of trouble for me, just to give the people in this country, in Germany, in Europe, and all over the world, just to give them a glimpse of a view what goes up behind the closed doors. Yes, there is many examples for that. If we go just back to history, if you go into the year 1988, if you go to your archives, you will find in March 1988 that there was in Iraq, the Kurdish people have been gassed with poisoned gas. That is known all over the world. But in July 1988, they sent me to a town called Zubaydat, that is on the Iraqi-Iranian border. There was war. It was war between the Iranians and the Iraqis, and I was sent there to photograph how the Iranians have been gassed with poisoned gas, with German poisoned gas. You call it Lost and Zarine, mustard gas, made by Germany. They have been gassed, and I was there to make photographs how these people have been killed by poisoned gas from Germany. When I came back to Germany, there was just one small photo in a newspaper, in the Frankfurter Allgemeine, and there was one small article not writing how impressive, brutally, how unhuman, how terrible it was to kill decades after the end of the Second World War, people with German poisoned gas. So this was a situation I feel misused for having been there, and just to give a documentary what has been done, but not being allowed to cry out to the world what we have done behind closed doors. Up to today, it's not well known in the public that with German public gas, there have been hundreds or thousands of people gassed in this city of Zubaydat. Now, you ask, what have I done for intelligence agencies? So, please see, most of the journalists you see in foreign countries, they claim to be journalists, and they might be journalists, European or American journalists, but many of them, like me in the past, are so-called non-official cover. That's what the Americans call that. I have been a non-official cover. Non-official cover means what? It means you too work for an intelligence agency. You help them if they want you to help them, but they will never, when you are locked, or when they find out that you are not only a journalist but a spy too, they will never say, "Oh, this was one of our guys." They will not know you. That means non-official cover. So I have helped them in several situations, and I feel ashamed for that too now. Like I feel ashamed that I have worked for a very recommended newspaper like the Frankfurter Allgemeine, because I was bribed by billionaires, I was bribed by the Americans not to report exactly the truth, but I just imagined in my car while I was driving to this interview, I just tried to work out in my brain what would have happened if I would have written a pro-Russian article in the Frankfurter Allgemeine. Well, I don't know what would have happened, but we were all educated to write pro-European, pro-American, but please, not pro-Russian. So I'm very sorry for that, but this is not what I understand for democracy and for press freedom. I'm very sorry for that. Well, yes, I understand your question very well. Germany is still a kind of a colony of the United States. You see that in many points, like the majority of the Germans don't want to have nukes in our country, but we still have American nukes. So we are still a kind of a colony of the Americans. And being a colony, it is very easy to approach young journalists through what is very important here is transatlantic organizations. All journalists from really respected and recommended big German newspapers, magazines, radio stations, TV stations, they are all members or guests of those big transatlantic organizations. And there, in these transatlantic organizations, you are approached to be pro-American, and there is nobody coming to you and saying, well, we are the Central Intelligence Agency, would you like to work for us? No, this is not the case how it happens. What they do, these transatlantic organizations, is they invite you for seeing the United States. They pay for that, they pay all your expenses and everything. So you are bribed, you get more and more corrupt, because they make you good contacts. You won't know that those good contacts are, let's say, non-official covers, or officially people working for Central Intelligence Agency or other American agencies. So you make friends. You think they are friends, and you cooperate with them. They ask you, well, could you do me this favor? Could you do me that favor? And so your brain more and more is brainwashed through these guys. And your question was, is this only the case with German journalists? No, I think it is especially the case with British journalists, because they have a much closer relationship. It is especially the case with Israelis, of course, with French journalists for a part, not that big as with German or with British journalists. It is the case for Australian journalists, for journalists from New Zealand, from Taiwan, from, well, there is many countries in the Arab world, like Jordan, for example, like Oman, the Sultanate of Oman. There is many countries where this happens, where you find people to claim they are respected journalists, but if you look behind them, you'll find they are puppets on a string of the Central Intelligence Agency. I'm sorry in interrupting you. I'll give you one example. Sometimes the intelligence agencies, they come to your office and want you to write an article. I give you an example not from strange other journalists, from me myself. I've just forgotten the year. I just remember that the German Foreign Intelligence, Bundesnachrichtendienst, it is just a sister organization of the Central Intelligence Agency. It was founded by the American Intelligence Agency. So one day, the BND, this German Foreign Intelligence Agency, came to my office at the Frankfurter Allgemeine in Frankfurt. And they wanted me to write an article about Libya and about Colonel Muammar Gaddafi. I had absolutely no secret informations regarding Colonel Muammar Gaddafi and Libya. But they gave me all these secret informations, and they just wanted me to write, to sign the article with my name. I did that, but it was an article that was published in the Frankfurter Allgemeine that originally came from the Bundesnachrichtendienst, from the German Foreign Intelligence Agency. So do you really think that this is journalism, intelligence agencies writing articles? Oh yes, that article, I have reprinted it partly in my book. That article was how Libya and Colonel Muammar Gaddafi, how he secretly tried to build a poison gas factory, I think in Rabta was the name, yeah. And I got all those informations. It was a story that was printed worldwide 2 days later. But I had no information on that. It was the intelligence agencies that wanted me to write this article. So, but this is not the way journalism should work, that intelligence agencies, that they decide what is printed and what not. If I say no, I give you an example from a very good example if you say no. Well, we have a rescue unit in Germany with helicopters for traffic accidents. It's called, they call themselves the Yellow Angels. There was one guy who didn't want to cooperate. He was a pilot of the helicopter service of the Yellow Angels in Germany. This guy said no to the Foreign Intelligence Service, Bundesnachrichtendienst, when they approached him and wanted him as a non-official cover to work for the German Foreign Intelligence Agency, under, just to pretend to be somebody from the Yellow Angels. So what happened was that he lost his job. And the court in Germany, the judge decided that they were right, because such a guy could not be trusted. He was kicked off his job because he didn't cooperate with the Foreign Intelligence Service. So I knew what would happen if I would not cooperate with intelligence services. Well, I have had, let me say, 6 times my house was house searched because I was accused by the public prosecutor, the German public prosecutor. I was accused of leaking secrets of states. 6 times house searched. Well, they hoped that I wouldn't do that ever again. But I think it's worse that the truth will come out one day. The truth won't die. And I don't mind what will happen. I've had 3 heart attacks. I have no children. So if they want to bring me to court or to prison, so it's worse for the truth.